In this video, I'm going to talk about group interests. Groups have interests. Groups don't really have friends. The worldly concept of a friend applies to individuals. Groups have interests. Groups have allies. There's a difference. Friends relate to individuals. Allies refer to groups. Because individuals have needs. Groups have interests. Okay? Now an individual can have an interest too, but interest is more applicable to groups. Why is it important? I'm going to use a piece of history to explain something to you. I'm not going deep into this history, you can do that yourself. This is about the Mosquito Kingdom, or Mosquito Kingdom. It was a kingdom, or better said, a confederacy that existed for a while, and it was under the, it was under the supervision of Britain. They had a king, and that turned into an hereditary chief eventually. But if you look at this carefully, it became a protectorate in 1638, but the first king was around 1650. Now, I went through some scanned archive documents about this issue, many of them also some Spanish ones. So I know quite something about the Mosquito Coast or Mosquito Kingdom, and it comes down to the following. Let me go back over here. You can have this map over here also. Around the 1500s, when Spain became dominant in the Americas and also in the Caribbean, Spain established its economy over there with institutions, and Spain conducted nation building. Because Spain itself was a union of two crowns, Castile and Leon, and both Castile and Leon consisted out of constituent kingdoms, constituent nations. So Spain itself was a unity of nations. They weren't really that united, to be frank, but they were a unity of nations. So when it came to the Americas, they could only extend their union. So the Union of Leon, Castile and Leon, extended itself by establishing autonomous kingdoms over here. Now this kingdom, Guatemala, that they established, was based on the geographic location, and Yucatan, separated from Guatemala, became a separate kingdom because it consists mostly of Mayas. You have some Mayas living within the kingdom of Guatemala also, but the Mayas wanted to have their own kingdom also, and the Spanish realized it's important to grant them their desire because they are constituents in the Spanish Empire. When that happened, there was this group of Indians. There was this tribe called the Mosquito, and the Mosquito did not want to be part of the Kingdom of Guatemala. However, because their territory was relatively small, the Spanish didn't see any benefit in granting them their own jurisdiction like the Mayans received with the Kingdom of Guatemala. The Spanish wanted to integrate them in this kingdom over here, governed from Antigua Guatemala. Well, the name wasn't Antigua back then, it was Santiago de Caballeros de Guatemala. That was their purpose. So the Spanish were constructing roads over here, they were building towns, establishing shipyards and all of that to make this a functional country. In 1570, this became a kingdom. In 1609, Yucatan separated from it. During that time, the Mosquito Indians, they attacked some of the Spanish settlements. They even attacked some of the other native tribes that collided with the Spanish. So this was kind of a war zone. And there were pirates that came along over here. But the Mosquito Indians didn't want anything to do with the pirates either. So they were kind of stuck because the whole Caribbean became Spanish, to be frank. So you were surrounded by them. And the Spanish weren't that much in number. It were the ethnicities around that collided with the Spanish. So what would you do then? Here's what happened. You had British sailors that came here for trade. Now, Britain eventually turned into a Protestant stronghold. So they didn't want anything to do with the Catholic economy of Spain. Nevertheless, Spain was dominant in the Americas. So the English, or British would say English, they longed to have their own economy in the Americas. You had the Dutch that through this pirate syndicate that they established got some islands that the Spanish tolerated them to administer, but the English wanted to have their own thing. So they established some companies that came to the Caribbean. One of them possessed two of the islands over here, and from those two islands they came in contact with the Mosquito Indians. And the Mosquito Indians was a collection of chiefdoms, so you have several chiefs who were the heads of wealthy families. They governed the Mosquito Nation. So there was no unified kingdom, but the chieftains realized, okay, we need to have unity here despite our conflicts, internal conflicts, because we need to stand as a group. So they agreed with the English company that they would submit to the King of England in exchange for maritime security against the Spanish. So I won't want to say elites, but the wealthy families of the Mosquito Indians, they sent one of their own, a young man, on a ship to England. And this man went into a contract with the British. And the British, well, at that time it was the English still, but you get what I'm saying, the English sent ships over there to guard the Mosquito Coast. It was around here. As a consequence, the Mosquito Indians had to have a central government. They didn't actually become centralized, but they need to have a central figure. So they submitted to one of their chieftains who became their king. And it worked like this. The English and later British used the Mosquito Coast for trade. And in exchange, you had British settlers that settled over there. And constructed plantations. You had slave trade also. And eventually the Spanish realized, you know what, we're not going to fight the Mosquito Indians. We're going to tolerate the Mosquito Kingdom. Why? Because now we can use it to divert negative attention. Because what happened? Because the British had this protectorate, many pirates and criminals came to the Mosquito Coast for trade and for settlement. So the rest of the Kingdom of Guatemala was left alone. So the Spanish looked at the bigger picture and realized, you know what, we're going to tolerate this. Actually, we own that piece of land, but we're going to allow the British to quote-unquote protect the Mosquito Indians. And by the way, the King of England, later King of Great Britain, and the King of Spain, they were all in agreement with this. It were the common people that thought it was a real fight, but as you know, this is how it goes in the world. Nevertheless, it was a real issue that they resolved in such a manner. The Mosquito Coast remained a British protectorate until in 1784 the Spanish forced the British to forfeit this kingdom, and the kingdom became a Spanish territory, because in 1784 the British began to expel their own settlers. Yes, they kicked out their own British people from the Mosquito Coast, and Spain began to introduce their jurisdiction over there. That was fought a lot. There was a lot of fights because the Mosquito Indians didn't want to submit to the King of Spain. Eventually, the viceroyalty of Peru, not Peru, viceroyalty of Nueva Granada, because this part became separate from Peru, eventually took over the Mosquito Coast for a while. Then it returned to the Kingdom of Guatemala, but it was a whole issue back then. After this area separated from Spain, this Mosquito Kingdom became an issue of contention between the Republic of Honduras and the Republic of Nicaragua. The Republic of Costa Rica wasn't that much bothered by it. Eventually, the Emperor of Austria had to meddle in the conflict also, because this is what happened. The people of the Mosquito Coast, they sent envoys to Europe eventually. They didn't rely only on the British, because the British eventually betrayed them. But eventually they had no choice but to receive some supervision from the British again. But meanwhile, they sent envoys to other powers. And it worked. Today, there is no Mosquito Kingdom anymore, but the Republic of Nicaragua has two autonomous provinces that belong to the Mosquito Nation. And in the Republic of Honduras, you have one district that's also unofficially autonomous. So they still have their own jurisdiction, but they are part of the Republics of Honduras and Nicaragua. Why am I telling you this piece of history? It's because I'm into this history in the sense that I'm so overwhelmed by the smartness of Mosquito Indians. No, I'm using it to teach you. These people here realize, oh, hold on, we're surrounded. We need to adapt. And they realize, as a group, we have interests. As a group, we need allies. So they checked what was going on. Oh, you had those English people over there from this cold country called England. They sought for trade partners. You know what? They're going to take advantage of it. And it worked in their favor. This is why, till this day, there is not much industry on the east coast of Nicaragua. Why? Because it used to be a region of contention. So even till this day, there is this conflict between the national administration of Nicaragua and the Mosquito Indians. So the fight isn't really over. But what you can learn from this group, the Mosquito Indians, is that they realized, as a group, we have interests. We don't want to belong to the Spanish administration, because that will destroy our traditions and the way we live here. And we will be divided and ruled by people from this church called the Roman Catholics that we don't trust. We have to deal with them one way or the other, so we're going to play it smart. And they did. Now, what can you learn from this? As a group, you need to see what's going on. You need to be alert. Don't think that there were no sellouts amongst Mosquito Indians that walked over to the Spanish. There were. And they were dealt with. The Mosquito Indians, they were smart. Eventually, the resistance was used by both the Spanish and the British. So they became part of a political game. Eventually, they weren't really aware of it, but that's what happened. But nevertheless, their own agency worked. And the pagan rulers of the world had to adapt to their agency. So, when you're faced with a challenge, as a group, you come together, at least your elders and your leaders ought to come together, and they ought to plan. And I don't say plan in the sense that they come with an idea and they hold on to it no matter what. That's what the world's teaching you. They come up with a plan, with a project to secure the group's well-being. If it means tolerating some things you don't initially wanted. The well-being of the group goes above all, so you do what's necessary to secure the group. Believers can learn from the practicality of the Mosquito Indians, even though they were pagans. Straight up, they were pagans. Okay? And they had some practices that can't be condoned. Okay? Many of the Mosquito Indians eventually turned to Christ. So, if that worked out well also, but learn from this history. Groups have interests. And in the world they understand this, that the groups have interests. Groups don't have friends. They may have friendship treaties between groups, but groups don't relate to each other through friendship, through emotional compensation. No, groups have interests. And groups have to be firm about their interests. Groups cannot always have things their way, but they are firm about their interests. And because of this, they make sure that their group is in a good state. They tell all members of the group, you better contribute to the well-being of the group. You want to be part of this group, you want to remain part of this group, we don't care if you're born into this group, you need to participate and comply with the welfare of this group. If you can't, due to some disability or due to some trauma, don't worry, we got your back, but still, one way or the other, you need to be loyal to the group. And groups that remain successful purge themselves by kicking those out that endanger the group. So, even though they had no king over them, they accepted one of their nobles became their king, even though it was not someone they actually longed to have a king. They realized we need this, or else we won't remain in existence as a group, or else we'll be exterminated, or we will be divided, and our lands will be taken, and we'll lose everything. Believers, I'm telling you, learn from this. Learn from this. Well, that's it for this video. Keep agreeing with Christ, the real King, and be at peace.